In 1991, a film known as What About Bob was released to theaters. And yes, I'm going to do one of these reviews of the summary film that you see on the internet all the time. And yes, this is going to be one of those where I do like a review summary, something you've seen on the internet all the time. But I want to talk about this film's trailer. Okay, don't be fooled by what you see in the trailer for this film. I mean, there's a lot of banjo music, and it's very upbeat. I didn't really see this film when it came out. I was in college at the time. I don't know why I didn't see it, but this trailer is somewhat misleading. It seems to show that, like, What About Bob is sort of this quirky family comedy. It isn't. I mean, it has like a PG rating, which today is like G, because that's just where we're at now. This film goes to some dark places. Not only that, the depiction of Bob, played by Bill Murray, could be viewed as ableist, and I want to talk about that in today's episode. This is Mark Rollins here for The Geek Church, the show. Okay, so the premise of What About Bob is both simple and very complex. Now, even though that What About Bob is made to be this kind of mainstream kind of comedy, the type we don't really see anymore, by the way. What I admire about What About Bob is it does a lot of things don't feel very mainstream at all. This film is going out of its way to do something different, something that I want to see more in films these days. Then again, most films there is a very clear-cut protagonist and a very clear-cut antagonist. But What About Bob really blurs the line. Now, exceptions can be made for how the protagonists and antagonists are depicted. For example, you might recall of the film The Fugitive, released in 1993, based off the show. That's a film that is very different because there isn't really a bad guy. Now, there is a clear-cut villain. The one that kills the character Richard Kimball's wife. That's the clear-cut villain. But Harrison Ford, Richard Kimball, the man wrongly accused, escapes from jail, and essentially he is doing the right thing. He's trying to find justice to the man who killed his wife. And there's another character, Sam Gerard, a U.S. Marshal, who's doing everything he can and his job to find him. So in the case of The Fugitive, these characters are both trying to do what's right, but they're at odds with each other. Now, this is great because both characters have a lot of charisma, and we're rooting for essentially both of them. And it's simply a matter of time before each of them come together and they defeat the bad guy. Now, What About Bob is different because there isn't really a hero. In fact, it's pretty obvious by the time we get to the end of the film, both the characters have become villains. Yeah, there's going to be spoilers here. In fact, you can view this story of What About Bob through a certain lens as a very, very dark comedy. Reminds me of some of the stuff that back in college I took a class in drama, and we learned about dark comedy and how things are played like this. I'm going to get back to what I learned about from drama in college here in a bit. It's going to circle back around, trust me. But for now, I want to talk about whether or not What About Bob is ableist. I think it'd be good to have a working definition of ableism before I start talking about it. Ableism is discrimination and social prejudice against people with physical or mental disabilities. The question remains is whether or not Bill Murray's performance as Bob Wiley encouraged this, because are we laughing at him and whatever kind of mental problems we have? I think I just said we have, I noticed that. I'm going to call that a Freudian slip. Basically, are we laughing at Bill Murray's mental problems, even though that in-universe he is probably suffering mentally? Well, let's talk about discrimination. Discrimination is, of course, ugly. Those that do it always seem to have a justification that they don't do it. They talk about how complex an issue is, and they aren't wrong, but they aren't right either. I've seen people that go out of their way to say, we're not being discriminatory, we're being blah, 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 but their words are discriminatory. I'm not going to give any examples here. But for the sake of argument, I mean, when it comes to discrimination, I might as well bring up the KKK for being just completely racist in their doctrine. Like, even though the rest of the world is trying to be less bigoted, they still hold on to this old school mentality that they can treat others in an inferior manner, like they have the right to and they should do this. And not only do they have these type of justifications, they are not changing. Now, when it comes to discrimination by race, it's very obvious when you're dealing with skin color, because you can tell who you need to discriminate by a look. But some cases of mental and physical discrimination, they're not obvious upon a look. There's a really famous scene from Seinfeld where Jerry is trying to strike up a conversation with this woman he's attracted with, and she seems to be ignoring him. And eventually he just gets frustrated and says, "What are you, deaf?" And at that point, the woman, who I believe is played by Marley Martin, a deaf actress, just says, after reading his lips, "Bingo." Now, personally, I like this joke because the context of the episode, it's showing that we can attempt to communicate with people, and if they don't respond the way we want them to, oftentimes we just assume, well, they're being a jerk. You could see that Jerry is being ableist here in a bit, but then again, anyone who's saying, "What are you, deaf?" is probably practicing some sort of ableism in some form. However, this episode of Seinfeld has this one particular scene in it that I think is one of the most funniest scenes ever written. And hey, I mean, when it comes to things that are out of date and didn't age well, Seinfeld is probably that. It has, in fact, their criticisms against the show today show morals that are very much out of date by today's standards. There's an episode where Elaine's date does something that is just lawsuit worthy when she says he whipped it out, and this is played for laughs, but it shouldn't be. This is pretty dang, this is pretty serious. So yeah, What About Bob is released in the early 90s, same time as around Seinfeld in some of the episodes that I was just talking about. It might be a case of humor that just isn't appropriate because it's ignoring the people that are hurt in the subject matter. And so is it wrong for us to be laughing at Bob, who is in fact suffering? I have to say that the issue is pretty complicated. As I mentioned before, I myself am on the autism spectrum. Because of that, it means that I have issues with social situations. I usually use the illustration of two gears that don't quite mesh together. Like if you've ever driven a stick shift, you might have unintentionally grind the gears. So yeah, I have trouble with social situations, just trying to figure out stuff. This doesn't mean that I can't be in social situations, and it doesn't mean that I can't thrive in them. I'm not saying that I'm the life of the party because, yeah, I'm not that arrogant. For the most part, there are times I just can't figure out what to say or how to start a conversation or to continue it, or politely stop a conversation that makes me uncomfortable. There's a lot of awkward pauses. Because of that, this has made me a target of bullying throughout the years, and I've already really discussed that at length in another episode. Now, I could easily, and I'm strongly tempted to, and might already have by making a video like this, call out those that have bullied me as being ableist. However, I believe they have sort of ignorance on their side. They don't know what they're doing. And I have to say this, I have some ignorance on my part as well, and I'm going to address those things. Yeah, being on the autism spectrum means that life can be really, really, really difficult at times. It can be hard to relate to things, and it can get very frustrating, and I can have tantrums, and I can get downright upset at people. Now I have to take full responsibility of these. These are my actions, and that means I need to experience the full consequences of them. Now I am grateful that in recent years we're starting to open our eyes to how terrible people with mental health have it, and how the system has failed over the years. And most certainly has told me just simply pull myself up by my own footstraps as the best advice, and not even really helping me. But the problem with having mental issues is you might not have the ability to change yourself. And when people start to believe that it's okay to change you because you are not able to do that, this is where it gets really, really ugly. I'm pretty sure my personal handicaps have caused me not to get jobs, and have definitely caused me to lose them. Again, I've already talked about that in several videos. Part of it is I don't mesh really well with good employers. My last job I had to leave because I felt there was some ableism toward me, even though it was done out of ignorance. I guarantee you that there are millions who suffer like me, and they don't get diagnosed until it's way later in life. Also, diagnosis was expensive. And I can't help but I'm watching one about Bob that this could be the case with the main character, Bob Wiley. I'm not sure if Bob is on the autism spectrum. An argument could be made that he has the symptoms. When we're introduced to Bob at the beginning of the film, he lives alone in this squalid apartment. His only friend is his fish, Gil. It was featured very prominently on the credits with some music by Miles Goodman. Feels like he's kind of impersonating Danny Elfman's style. Now we see Bob punch his card for work, but I'm not really certain if Bob actually works because it isn't really shown him making money on a job. He must be making money somewhere, otherwise he couldn't afford to a psychologist. But working at home was done in the 90s, but it was pretty rare. It could also be possible that he's just punching his clock because it's just some ritual that he does. And there are many rituals that he does in this film. For example, he does this thing where he rubs his temples like this and goes, "I feel good, I feel great, I feel wonderful." It's a mantra to be sure, and he clearly uses it to motivate himself to get out of bed in the morning. As someone who experiences this literally daily, as in it's impossible for me to get out of bed sometimes, I have to say that trying to lie to yourself by saying that everything is great is not the best therapy. But if you start feeling helpless, you will cling to many straws. Okay, so life is pretty difficult for Bob, and to contrast with Leo Marvin, who's played by Richard Dreyfuss. Leo is this psychologist who works in downtown Manhattan and apparently makes enough so he can work there. And he's just published this book called Baby Steps, which is essentially this idea that to look at your life in very terms of small goals. It's actually a pretty good concept, really. In fact, Good Morning America wants to interview him, which is a rare opportunity for any psychologist. So when we're introduced to Leo Marvin, he gets a call from another psychologist who wants to unload Bob Wiley on him. This fellow psychologist is clearly retiring, cleaning out his desk and everything, because he can't stand Bob anymore. And after he deals with his business, we hear the man take his possessions and just say, "free." And this definitely sets enough foreshadowing so that we know what type of person Bob is. Now Bob, who we see, is apparently uses a tissue to touch anything around him. That includes like doorknobs, stuff like that. So I guess he's a germaphobe, maybe? There's one spot where he hears rap music as he leaves his apartment. It's ripped off from Oliver and Company. Yeah, I don't really have a bigger point there. I just happened to notice that. This is a Touchstone film, so that's like under the Disney umbrella. I guess this is... I don't know. When you watch enough Disney stuff, you start to see things just leak in from other Disney properties, and it's just weird. Okay, so Bob does make it to Leo's office, clearly having problems with the enclosed spaces, not to mention the city streets, which I personally have a huge problem with too. I don't really like going through the streets of the city. Does anyone? Anyway, I think there's a man he passes who has maybe Tourette syndrome, maybe. Which becomes a huge plot point in this thing, but I'll get to that. It causes Bob to repeat his mantra, only louder, as if it'll help. Now, Bob is, of course, afraid of the elevator and decides to take the stairs. Yeah, I know that clip is from Ghostbusters, but I mean, could you tell? Okay, so when Bob is first introduced to Leo, the first thing he sees is a picture of Leo's family, and he tries to guess who they are, which is odd, to be honest. It's a weird scene, and this film is full of them. But it shows how quirky his character is, and I think it's pretty good. It's clear that the scene is there so that Bob sees Leo's family for the first time, at least in photo form. Now, generally, I think in the psychological community, you probably... I don't know. There's definitely a distance that you want to keep a patient from yourself and your family, which is very understandable. And this type of boundary is put on a huge spotlight in this film. Okay, now thinking about psychologists that I've seen in films, most psychologists are just guys who do nothing but sit around and ask the right questions. In all honesty, that's probably who psychologists should be. Just give a listening ear, not telling the patient what to do, but rather encourage the patient to do what they believe is right. But most movies have taken this a step further, and most psychologists are seen as quacks. For example, there's a scene in the film Freaky Friday, the one from, I think, 2003 with Jamie Lee Curtis. She just tells her daughter, who's trying to play a role of a psychologist, to just say, and how does that make you feel? And there's a similar scene in What About Bob? When Bob is talking about his life, Leo just says, talk about, insert last word from patient's sentence here. Bob explains that he doesn't know what his problem is, but attempts to show the symptoms. This is where he fakes Tourette's syndrome, which, honestly, I think this moment's pretty funny. But I don't really know how, this might be ableist toward people with Tourette's syndrome, but I'll get to that a little later. I do like the line that Bob says, where he says, if I can fake it, I know I don't have it. Personally, I love it when movies drop wisdom like this, and it actually keeps me watching them. It's a stop clock situation, really. And I think it's really telling when Bob fakes a heart attack, Leo Marvin just kind of sits there. It's both professional and unprofessional at the same time. And like I said before, professionalism is really one of the themes here. But the fact that Leo Marvin just kind of does nothing, and then just kind of asks if he's married, I think is very telling. Also, it turns out Bob actually was married. Bob says they broke up because of a like of Neil Diamond, which to me is really strange. This is the only time this is really brought up. Leo figures that it has to be something else, giving his psychological analyses. Leo's analysis of Bob's failed marriage is apparently this revelation to Bob, who just does this thing where he goes, ouch! And he believes that Dr. Marvin can help him, saying it out loud even. Now, someone who has been a part of evangelicalism, that kind of thing, most people start to believe they can be helped when they turn to God, but they are often turning to specific people, like pastors. This is why certain television preachers have become multimillionaires, because, well, they sell you the cure. And this is really the opposite of Jesus' ministry. I'm not really going to talk about that because I did a video about that already, and there's starting to be a lot of themes here I'm just touching on. It should be noted that for Leo's prescribed treatment is giving him a copy of his book, which he just kind of, there's this scene where he just sort of like casually pulls it off the shelf, but he's like looking at his bookcases as if, and there's like entire section of his book, and he goes, there it is. And he's just, why does he do this? It's just like, there it is, just take it. But no, he has to do this sort of ritual where he's sort of like, oh yeah, here it is. And he just sort of humbly takes it off the shelf when it's just there's a whole shelf of this book here. He knows where it is. Not only does he give Leo the book, tells him and prescribes to do the stuff in it, he charges him for the book, which seems kind of heartless, but I still feel like this is both professional and unprofessional. Like, I don't think this would be frowned upon if an actual psychologist did this. Okay, so as I mentioned before with, Christian believers and preachers, they tend to latch on to the people that they believe that can help them or can cure them, so to speak. So Bob latches on to Leo. And Leo tells Bob that he's taking a leave of absence, and Bob just doesn't really accept it. But Leo insists that, hey, I'll get back to you on vacation. I have another psychologist who fell in for him. Okay, so then later that night after this appointment, Bob has some sort of panic attack or some sort of trigger. It isn't really stated here. It really isn't, which is kind of problematic. Now he tries to contact Leo personally, and does all kinds of tricks, which I have to admit, you shouldn't do this, okay? Like, for example, when Bob calls the call center to contact Leo directly, she does. Basically, she does that thing where the call center contacts the psychologist and just basically says, like, okay, I'll put you through. Even when Leo takes this call, Leo tells the person in the call center, you know better than that, but hey, exceptions can be made, and there are times where I guess this can happen. And this is a pretty complex issue that this film is putting in the spotlight, which I kind of like. So yeah, when Bob does contact Leo, Leo just says, if it's an emergency, contact the hospital or contact the other doctor I recommended. Now, at one point in time, Bob just pretends to be Leo's sister, and of course, you know, the emergency service call service puts him through to Leo, and yeah, that's pretty terrible. When Leo takes this call and going like, "Don't pretend to be my sister," he feels very threatened. I don't think he necessarily drops Bob as a patient, but he definitely hangs up on him. At this point in time, Bob gets super desperate and goes into the call center physically as an undercover cop, just so he can get Leo's contact information. And he does it with a story that Bob has unalived himself. I guess I have to say that because I think if I say that, or if I use the term that I want to use, this one that starts with an S, I will get flagged, I guess. I don't know. Basically, when Bob is this undercover officer, he basically goes like, yeah, I need to contact Leo Marvin personally, gets his address in Lake Winnipesaukee. If you think about it, this scene is pretty dark, but this film doesn't really want you to think about how serious this is. Now here's the thing about What About Bob? These characters of Leo and Bob are constantly doing these things to each other. And whenever a character does something bad to another, it's almost like the other character goes, I'll see it in rays. For example, when the phone service calls Dr. Marvin and says that Bob has unalived himself, he's more relieved than regretful. Leo just basically just goes like, well, I guess our vacation won't be interrupted anymore, and just hangs up the phone. Now, I'm guessing the American Psychological Association or Psychiatric Association, one of those, would probably say that's an ideal follower, because I'm assuming that they want doctors who would not be too affected by their patient's suicide. This idea that it's a professional business, the patient did this to himself, and so on. I've never known anybody who essentially taken their own life. From what I know, I'm sure that if I ever did, I would probably be thinking thoughts like, oh, if only I had said a certain thing to this person, then maybe they'd still be alive today, something like that. But, yeah. Okay, so after Bob gets the address of Leo's vacation home in Winnipesaukee, Bob actually gets on a bus and goes there. Now, it's really interesting to see how Bob is willing to overcome his fear of traveling and a lot of these fears that I kind of have, just to get to something where he could solve his problems. I think that's very telling, actually. As someone on the autism spectrum, you should know that those on the spectrum have to overcome a lot of frustration and a lot of anguish just to have what you consider a normal day. And yeah, and really stop telling us to just smile more, okay? That's really, just stop doing that. Okay, now one of the reasons why Leo is actually taking this vacation is he wants to go to his summer home, because he has one, because he's rich, to have a good backdrop for when Good Morning America stops by. And there's even a scene where he's getting groceries, and he's talking to the checker of the local store, and he's doing his humble brag best here. And I think this is before the term humble brag was even a term, but man, Leo Marvin is doing it in spades in this one scene. Okay, so when Bob shows up, Leo's first response is to try and shield his family from him. And Leo then tries to defuse what could be an explosive situation and tells Bob to wait in a diner where he'll call him later. Yeah, this is before we had cell phones. Okay, now to his credit, Leo had every intention of keeping that promise, as later on they show him in a summer place trying to find the phone number of that establishment. But he's surprised that Bob is literally at the door. Yeah, as it so happens, the one that owned the diner, the one that Leo told Bob to wait at, they always wanted the house that Leo owns right now, and he just swept in and bought it like that. That is, Leo swept in and bought it like that. This is one of those plot coincidences that turns out to be a huge convenience, and maybe a few more drafts of the script could have fixed this, but hey. In fact, we actually see these characters many times in the film, and they're usually on a boat near Leo's house for some reason, like demons or ghosts, really. We'll get to that. Okay, so Bob meets Leo's family, and you can tell Leo is doing everything he can to distance himself from his family from Bob without going too hard. The problem is the family seems to like him, and Bob takes time to compliment them. And, and then Leo takes Bob aside and asks him a question that, hey, I would have gotten wrong. Okay, so Leo's not willing to take time off from his vacation, which makes a lot of sense. And hey, Bob really should be looking to see another psychologist. And so, yeah, again, you can debate who's right or who's wrong in this situation. But Leo gives Bob a piece of paper that's the most vague of advice, which just says, take a vacation from your problems. It should be noted that when Leo starts writing this thing, Bob actually thinks that he's just going to write him another prescription, and Bob apparently is on a lot of medication. Anyway, Bob actually takes Leo's advice, but not the way Leo wanted him to. Bob takes a vacation in Lake Winnipesaukee. Which is assuming that he got time off from his real or unreal job. So Bob stops by for a visit, meeting the family once again. And at that point in time, Leo just calls a very quick family meeting to tell them to stay away from Bob. And by meeting, I mean basically just like, okay, everybody, all right, we're all clear. Let's just stay away from Bob. You know, he does one of those kind of mansplaining kind of things here. So when Bob is walking home from Leo's place, Leo's daughter, by the way, Leo has 2 kids, one who's much older, I don't really remember her character's name, and he has a teenager. So anyway, so Leo's daughter picks up Bob on the way home and invites him to go sailing. Now, Bob is old enough to be her father, and I have to say, it's not very believable that this character would invite Bob to go along with their sailing. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense. But it leads to that shot of the trailer with Bob being tied to a boat and sailing and being very ecstatic about it. And from what I can tell, I'm guessing Bob probably asked himself to be tied to the boat because of his personal fears. It's very much implied. We just jump cut from that to the sailing thing. So, hey. Okay, so when Leo notices that his daughter has taken Bob sailing, in spite of course, him saying, like, stay away from Bob Wiley. He has a talk with her. It's a really odd way of doing this. He's got this puppet for some reason. And he's like, yeah, he has puppet versions of his family in his home for some reason. Some method of interacting with his kids. And it's a very odd scene. I'm not really certain what this film is pretty quirky, but this might be a stretch too far in any universe. I don't know. And this is really odd because, kids grow up, and so he must have to update those puppets, like, all the time, right? I mean, that just makes sense. Actually, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Yeah, I'm kind of wondering how Leo keeps a psychological license. Anyway, one of the things that I do like about this scene is that it gets down to the point of it, is that Bob is in fact fun. He is willing to try new things, and he's kind of everything that Leo is not, which I think is one of the reasons why his family starts to like him. And Bob then visits the Marvins once again, and he helps Leo's son, Sigmund, named after, of course, Sigmund Freud, to dive, and something that Leo has been unsuccessful in doing. And when Leo sees that Bob has kind of helped his son dive, he really tries to get Bob out of the picture, really trying to distance his family, just saying, okay, you can leave, I'll take over from here. And at that point in time, Leo literally pushes Bob out of the way. Now, you could say this is sort of a passive-aggressive anger. I'm really going to have to say that's probably what this is. Fortunately, Bob has a life jacket on, and they makes it to the shore. And, yeah. So this causes the family to have more sympathy for Bob and less sympathy for Dr. Leo Marvin. And, of course, those people that own the diner, they're on a boat kind of seeing this all happen. And Leo gets really just angry and stuff like that. So, yeah, I'm not sure if... Leo pushing Bob out there is put there for very much plot convenience, and so we start to hate Leo now. There's a lot of things going on here that are kind of manipulating the audience, but I actually think that, for the most part, the writing in this film is pretty smart. So, yeah. Yeah, okay. The writing in this film is smart, but it's by no means perfect, but no film is. But when this film, What About Bob, does its writing well, it is very good. So, yeah, I'm going to say that. Okay, as Bob washes up, and for some reason they have an outdoor shower there, Leo says something that I'm sure is heard by Trump's closest followers. As Bob starts to wash off in this outdoor shower that they have there, Leo says this. Okay, at this time the family is really believing that Leo owes Bob an apology, which makes a lot of sense. But really, the smartest thing Leo could have done was apologize when that thing happened, and because honestly, if I had discovered that I had accidentally pushed somebody or deliberately pushed someone on there, I would have hoped that my first response would have been helping them get out of the water and then apologizing all the way, and then Leo does none of those things. So Leo doesn't even really apologize to Bob. He just kind of goes up to him while he's in the shower and just kind of, gives him his face thing. But it's Faye, who's Leo's wife, who insists that Bob be invited over for dinner. So we later see Bob over for dinner, and he really appreciates Faye's cooking so much. It's a little too overjoyed about it, honestly. Leo finally gets very snippy to the point of yelling at Bob, and I think this kind of gets a little, I don't know. I think there was a time where fathers on TVs had really quick tempers, and this was kind of like a staple of things. Now I feel like if you were to show a father with a quick temper, that would be the point that would be a wrong thing rather than just something that people did. Okay, now there's a scene where Leo chokes on his dinner, and I have to admit I have kind of been wondering what would happen if you just took this scene out. Because it involves with Bob essentially saving Leo's life from choking. Of course, as Leo is perceiving the situation, Bob is simply pounding him while his family is cheering him on. And I'm thinking that is the perception we're supposed to get from this thing and how Leo sees it versus to what is really going on. And I think it's interesting that, again, after Bob does save Leo from choking, Leo's first response is not thankfulness, but is rather just telling him, "Get off me!" And I get it. I mean, that's a hard situation to be in, and you might not be at your best. But, and also Bob is not doing the choking procedure nearly as correct. I'm pretty sure that's not the Heimlich maneuver. Anyway, Leo wants Bob to leave, but unfortunately it starts raining, and they left the car at the dock because this was actually established because when Leo did his puppet therapy with his daughter, he tells his daughter to leave the car. So this is kind of Leo's fault at this. And here's the thing. I mean, there's several ways about this because Leo says, like, hey, Bob can borrow his slicker. And all I can think about is like, well, Leo, why don't you put on the slicker, walk to the car, go get the car, and bring Bob home. But then I sort of feel like, well, maybe Leo doesn't want Bob to be alone with his family, so they could just love him and hate on Leo more. There's a lot of... I don't like it when films do this, where they present a problem and I, as the audience member, go like, well, why don't you just do this? But I can actually kind of see Leo's logic in this film. So, yeah. Plus, also, characters can get, and even in real life, people can get so engulfed in a situation that they don't see the most obvious solution. So, is this a forced plot point? Yes, it is. But I will have to say that it's even more forced when they have to have Bob spend the night. Now, I realize that, in a situation where this happens, the best thing is to have Bob spend the night on the couch, which they have in their living room, because we've seen Bob pound Leo on this couch. But for some reason, they have Bob share a room with their son. Even in the early 90s, you would not do that. I can't even think of a situation where I would do that. Where if I had a guest over my house, I would put them up with my youngest son in his own bedroom. That just doesn't make any sense here. Did we really not fear that type of thing? Because Leo is fearing this. He's actually discussing this with his wife and how he's worried. So during the nighttime, Bob and young Sigmund are talking, and this is when Bob introduces Sigmund to Tourette syndrome, and they just start just jumping on the bed and swearing aloud. Now, I'm sure this film would be PG-13 now, and their swear words are pushing the PG barrier, but hey. And I guess here's the time to insert that South Park episode where they talk about Tourette syndrome, where Cartman sort of pretends to have it, and then eventually he just doesn't have any filter for his mouth whatsoever. A lot of people really liked that episode of South Park, that it put Tourette syndrome in a light that was realistic, even in spite of that show being very satirical in how it depicts things. This, in What About Bob, is not a good depiction of Tourette syndrome. Now, keep this in mind, that you have a guest in your house, and then you have them share a room with your youngest son. And then during the night, your son starts swearing with the guy and starts jumping on the bed. If this guest was the same age as your son, you just tell them to quiet down. And I get the feeling that the way the scene is framed, that Bob is sort of meant to have this mentality of a child. I'm going to bring this up now because I believe this film does do a lot of infantilizing. I think I'm pronouncing that word correctly. That is, Bob's mental problems reduce him to that of a child. That term infantilizing, it does mean to treat someone as a child, which denies their maturity and age of experience. And I'll go ahead and bring this up now. There was a lot of controversy a few months ago as this scene from, say, the show The Good Doctor, which is a show about a doctor with autism, yelling at somebody that he is a surgeon. And this got memed to heck. I'm gonna give you one last chance to there was a lot of controversy because they felt like they're infantilizing somebody who has autism. And, in other words, we're seeing a character who has an emotional tantrum without any sense of context. Now, my personal take on this is, being on the autism spectrum myself, I am tired of the infantilizing. And yeah, there are times where it's just like, I'm really sick of this way you treat me, and yeah, I'm going to tell you how I feel. And yes, I can understand that why, having not seen this episode of The Good Doctor, I can understand why this character could get upset. The issue is, I believe Bob is being treated like a child in this film. There's even a scene where when he first finds Leo Marvin on his vacation, there's a scene where he goes, "Gimme, man, I need," and he does sort of act like a child. So yeah, does this thing infantilize Bob? I'm going to say yes. Alright, let's get back to the plot of the movie, though. Leo is trying to get Bob to leave so he can have his interview with Good Morning America. Unfortunately, Good Morning America shows up a lot early, and they just assume that Leo wants Bob to be there. And then they have one of those strange kind of sitcom situations where Leo tells Bob to tell GMA not to be on it, but then Good Morning America comes up to Bob with Leo in the room, and then Leo says, "Sure, you can be on it." It's kind of miscommunication, stuff like that. It's a scene that I've seen before, and there's a lot of scenes in What About Bob that I have to admit I've seen before in like other situation comedies and other comedies. And there's stuff that I've seen in What About Bob that honestly I think I've seen in other films. For example, the scene where Leo's trying to wake up Bob, and the only thing that wakes him up is a chime of a small alarm. I've seen that scene so many times. I'm actually wondering if What About Bob did it first. Anyway, so they have this interview, and during this thing, Leo kind of freezes. He doesn't really, it's not handled very professionally. Bob sort of takes over. And not only that, Bob brings in the family in front of the camera for the interview, something that Leo didn't do. In fact, when Good Morning America came in, Leo didn't even bother introducing his family, which shows how much Leo takes his family for granted. So after the interview is over and Good Morning America leaves, Leo is very upset, believing that his dealing with Bob really caused him to be not prepared for this interview, and he, of course, blames Bob for that. And then from there, Leo tries to get Bob committed, which doesn't work. Instead, Bob is just standing around entertaining his staff in a scene that I don't think was scripted. I think they just got some real hospital orderlies and just got Bill Murray to start doing his shtick and just had a reaction. I think that's probably how that scene was done. Okay, so on the way back, Leo just kind of loses it, and to the point where he can't even speak correctly. And Leo gets a speeding ticket and then tries to leave and gets a flat tire and then gets splattered by a passing car. Again, I don't know if has anyone ever had that happen to them? I've seen that in a lot of movies where a car passes by and splats somebody, and but it did rain the following night, so good job for continuity. Anyway, but this is sort of a TV convention that does happen a lot, and I kind of feel like this is a part in the film where it just feels like life is just crapping on Leo for just no apparent reason. So yeah, just making it worse. I think it's kind of feels a little bit forced. Okay, so this leads to Leo being home late, and there's a surprise party for him. Now apparently, it's shown by I think Bob actually tells Leo to be home by 7. So if he was home by 7, why is it so dark in the summertime? And why didn't anyone go after him if Leo is home so late? And if this is a surprise party, yeah. I mean, they're waiting in silence for a long time, man. Of course, Leo looks like a complete wreck after his day, and he's almost willing to snap back from that because it's like, I mean, hey, he's surrounded by people that just love him and they want to congratulate him. Because Leo's ego is huge, and he loves being loved. He even sees his sister, who's visiting. But when Leo sees his sister with Bob, that's when he really snaps. And then he just attacks Bob. Yeah. Now, this scene where he attacks Bob, I mean, Leo's not hauled off to prison or arrested or anything. But apparently, I guess he's resting in his home without any supervision there. I mean, I kind of wonder, like, boy, the law in Wake Winnipesaukee isn't very good, is it? Okay, so the family does get together with Bob, and they ask Bob to leave because they think that might be the best thing for Leo, and Bob does, but on the way back, as Bob is walking away from his home, he gets scared, and then he goes back to desperately seeking Dr. Leo Marvin's help, which doesn't really make a lot of sense because Leo Marvin just attacked him. But I've seen this happen before in situations where I've discussed before, where there's preachers and in this kind of relationship. Oftentimes, people that are evangelical believers can take a lot of abuse from their pastors. So yeah. So honestly, maybe points for maybe this is kind of a good thing they showed that. I don't know. Not that showing these things are a good thing. You know what? I don't know what point. Anyway, Leo decides to get rid of Bob for good using some very potent gunpowder to blow him up and puts a bomb on him and jokes that it's death therapy. Now, Bob actually thinks that Leo is just using some kind of metaphor for his own therapy, doesn't think this is real, and so Bob just goes, baby unties his own knots. So Bob does escape from those bombs around him, and then later on he meets up with Leo and his family, and he has a cake there, and of course Leo thinks that the cake is with its flaming candles is right in front of the bombs, but apparently the bombs were put in Leo's house, which blows up. This is attempted murder, okay? Next time we see Leo, he's in like a hospital in sort of this catatonic state. And from there, young Sigmund tells him that the worst is over, and then it jump cuts to Bob marrying Leo's sister. Because why not? Of course, they get to that part where there's a line, you gotta say if anyone should speak up or forever hold their peace. And Mother Fletcher said it already, and then Leo rises up to protest this thing, but they all think that Leo's essentially breaking himself out of his catatonic state. So from the point of view of this film, it seems like it's a happy ending. Yeah, not really. Really, the only ending we see is some text written on the screen that basically says that Bob became a psychologist, writes a book called Death Therapy, and Leo is suing for rights, which I'm guessing means that Leo and Bob have a really strained relationship now, and I can't help but think that Leo's family is probably going to be siding with Bob all the more, since, well, Bob is now family. Bob is Uncle Bob now. I can't help but think that this relationship that Leo has with his wife and kids would definitely fall apart, and there would be a divorce, okay? I'm very glad there isn't a sequel that would show this, because I don't really want to see that in any given form. Of course, this could be one of those films where they make one of those sequels that's like way too late, and then if they wanted to explore this thing, then that would be a very dark comedy, or not even really a comedy. I think it'd be more a dramedy. I don't know. Now, I remember when I first saw this film, I turned it off and said, that's the most funniest film I've ever seen. I still hold to that. I think there's some really great laugh out loud moments in this film. And like I said before, the writing is very good. It's not perfect, but I like the way the events flow and lead to the conclusion of Bob becoming Leo and Leo becoming Bob. It's a very different type of comedy that does play a lot of risks and tries to do different things, and they pay off really well. Okay, so I'm done with my review like the nostalgia critic, and I really got to stop using that photo all the time. Yeah, I met Doug once. Now, I haven't really answered the question, but I think I've laid out most of the evidence. So is What About Bob ableist? I think you can answer that question with something that I hear often, which is you could not make this insert film here today. And oftentimes the movie Blazing Saddles shows up because there's a few scenes in that film that are very problematic and would come across as racist, sexist, and otherwise. Now, I already mentioned the 2003 film Freaky Friday. There's a scene that has this guy who's undergoing psychological stress in Jamie Lee Curtis' office. Now, I watched a kind of a criticism review of the film from a reviewer named Nick DeMario, who I admire, and he stated that this scene is ableist, and I have to agree with him on that. Okay, I can't remember if I mentioned this before on one of my shows, but it used to be you could have a character that would speak in a foreign accent, and the joke is that this character speaks broken English, like that scene in A Christmas Story where it shows the Chinese waiter singing Deck the Halls. And I remember seeing the scene on Family Guy where Peter says the scene is racist. And it certainly did not come across as racist back then, but I think we all know that a lot of older movies and TV shows come across as racist. And to the point where it's like, how did you not even see that? But one thing is for sure, we're past the point of seeing a person speak with an accent as funny in any way. I mean, there's a reason why we wouldn't approve of, say, Fisher Stevens' performance in Short Circuit, where he plays an Indian who is not an Indian in real life, but he just has this accent. Same thing that happened to Apu on The Simpsons. I mean, they had to make up an accent in country so Bronson Pinchot could do that character Balky on Perfect Strangers, presumably not to offend cultures. And then later, after Perfect Strangers was over, he's on a show Step by Step where he imitates a French guy. Don't you think it would have gone the other direction? So yeah, we don't do the funny foreign man bit anymore. And not only has it been done to death, but it's just downright insensitive. English is one of the hardest languages to learn, and watching someone struggle with it and trying to fit into English-speaking society is just not funny. Yeah, some words get mixed up. You try putting yourself in that other country and see how well you do. I wonder if that's funny to them. So, when we're watching What About Bob, we're seeing his psychological stress as funny. We're seeing that as funny, right? Well, it's not really funny, and I don't really think it's supposed to be. Remember how I said I was in drama class in college? Well, for one of my assignments, I had to see this play that was called The Boys Next Door. And the play was about four mentally challenged people living together. And their interactions were funny to watch from an outside point of view. But I get the feeling like if you were in this room with those people, it wouldn't come across as funny at all. So in watching What About Bob, there are scenes that are just funny on the surface. I don't know, it's like the other day I was watching Dumb and Dumber, and I couldn't help but thinking that I feel like if we were to see people like Harry and Lloyd now, we would assume that they were mentally challenged. And we wouldn't assume that their actions were dumb or anything. We would assume that they were done out of absolute ignorance, and we would want to get them help, right? I don't know how I'm supposed to look at things anymore. So when it comes to What About Bob, though, when you're seeing somebody who has had similar panic attacks like Bob has, or have been in the room where somebody has had panic attacks like Bob, there's nothing funny about it, really. But then again, film and TV shows, they show scenes that are played for laughs, but might trigger us in some way. I mean, you're always going to have this. For example, I was in a serious car accident in 2012, and for a while I couldn't watch movies where serious car accidents were shown. And yeah, there are scenes that show gun and gunshots that are there for their enjoyment, like Die Hard. Die Hard is one of my favorite films, but I'm sure it probably feels like a slap in the face from somebody who has been in the military and seen actual combat with PTSD for the price of their service. It's getting into a lot of other issues. You see my point here. I don't think we should have a character like Bob done in the way it was done then. That is, having panic attacks for laughs. I've seen films and TV shows depict mental health a lot better, but mental health is very difficult to portray, really. Honestly, I'm struggling to find good examples of it. Now, it's to its credit, I would have to say that Bob is not the target for the humor here in this film. It's rather the system that Leo subscribes to. In fact, I'd have to say Leo is a symbol of white privilege. I mean, he has some good ideas, implemented them well in his baby step program. I feel like this character could exist today as some sort of influencer. And Leo references Dr. Ruth, who was quite the prominent pop psychologist back in the day, making her brand, talking about very explicit sexual things. And yes, I understand Dr. Ruth has just passed away. This has been a very recent thing that didn't even happen when I was writing this. And so, yeah. It's pretty clear that in this film, Leo wants to be that type of famous psychologist. And we see that in his worship of Sigmund Freud. And there's like a bust for Sigmund Freud wherever he is. There's one in his office. There's even one in his home. And when his home blows up, the bust somehow shoots off and then lands at their feet, like this weird kind of golden calf imagery. Now, what we don't see is how hard Leo worked to get where he is. But it's pretty well implied that those days of him working hard are well behind him, and he only has great success on the brain. And people like this are really hard to be around, and maybe what happens to Leo is kind of poetic justice. I mean, Leo doesn't really help Bob in any way, and it can be argued that Bob got out of his funk in his own way. In fact, it seems like everything that Leo is trying to do to not help Bob helps Bob, and the things that he, you know, it's kind of weirdly flipped. So yeah, I kind of feel like there's this sense where people that are really trying to help others just want the spotlight of them looking great. And I think Leo is this type of guy. And there's kind of a scene where, I think there's a really telling scene that when Leo cracks up, Bob actually makes a suggestion on a prescription for Leo, and the doctor actually takes his advice, showing that essentially Bob has become the psychologist now. There's actually even a scene before this where Bob is about to touch something with his Kleenex and he decides to just forget about the Kleenex altogether. Now, is this trying to show that Bob is essentially cured? Real life doesn't really work that way. It's very clear that Bob has helped himself, and I'm going to say that Leo didn't really do that much to help with it. But it's pretty clear that Leo does take his family for granted. And it's not like Leo has mistresses or anything, but he definitely expects his family to follow him with whatever he's doing. And even the vacation that he's taking isn't really a vacation. It's more like, it's just, a way for him to just establish his interview with Good Morning America. Now, Leo does have a moment of clarity, whereas his kids are both telling him that he's no fun, and he actually takes this advice to heart as much as he can. But when he sees that Bob is sort of filling in this role that he should be playing, this is where he gets kind of angry and just kind of wants to shun Bob and to stick with whatever plan he was doing before. In a way, it's kind of like Trump's people, they're not willing to change their ways. They just want to make America great again. So, yeah, I really got to start making that comparison to Trump and stuff like that, but I have a hunch it's going to be difficult in these next few months. So, yeah, to answer the question, I don't think that What About Bob is ableist, because if anything, it's criticizing why society is unfair to people like Bob. I actually think what it's trying to say is that there are people that who are born with mental problems like Bob that are really not getting the help they need, and that those that help them aren't doing a really good job, and they have just as much potential to be as crazy as Bob, even crazier. Likewise, those that can help can essentially be like Bob. We see Bob really helping out the Marvin family by just being Bob. And there's, and I think that's actually kind of good in a way. Maybe you disagree with me. Maybe there's things I didn't really bring up that I really should have. But I think the good points seen in What About Bob far outweigh the infantilizing, the stress attacks, and other infantilizing that has happened in this film. And yes, I do have to say, I wish that they didn't really go that direction. I kind of feel like this infantilizing would be one thing that if they remade What About Bob, which I feel like somebody is probably doing that, or somebody's just got to do that because they remake everything. I feel like that would be taken out. I don't know what kind of kid gloves they would have to deal with now in doing a modern day What About Bob remake, but hey. Anyway, I think I've answered my question with this video essay, so I didn't really expect to do a video about What About Bob, as I was expecting to do a video about X-Men in the 80s, but when I was doing the research, I found out how complex the topic was, and I just fell down a rabbit hole reading all these X-Men comics from the 60s and 70s. Really got very handy with X-Men. Maybe I'll do a whole series about X-Men later. Right now I'm working on a 2-book deal that's about books that, I'll talk about when I get to that episode of my show. In the meantime, the next episode of The Geek Church, I might cover something that's very similar to X-Men. But hey, I don't want to make promises that I can't keep. For now, this has been Mark Rollins from the Geek Church, signing off.